Hello.
Hey, how we doing?
I'm here with Aaron Nicastri. So Aaron and we would have met maybe a couple of years ago.
Yep, through jiu-jitsu.
Through jiu-jitsu. So I was this, roaming vagabond that used to just turn up at random places. No, but I actually got invited by another mate, Jason Tan. And on Sundays there's this, what we call it midgets crew, but it's just a bunch of guys who are a bit smaller in stature.
Who are technically pretty sound and pretty advanced for the Sydney scene of jiu-jitsu.
Yep. And and so we were just rolling through there, and then over time, we've gotten closer and closer, and we're now sitting in an empty gym here in Canterbury for reasons outside of both Aaron and I's control with this whole COVID-19 thing going on. But we are socially distanced here. We're seated probably a good almost 2 meters apart. And
all by the mats.
Yeah. And it was interesting actually, because when I first came in, the first thing I noticed was Aaron's got this elaborate setup where the classes are now being conducted online, and I was like, whoa, okay, and then Aaron was, and I'll let Aaron talk about it a bit more, but obviously we're all obviously adjusting to a new normal at the moment.
Yeah, we're definitely in big changes of big time changes in the way that we have to operate and interact with the world, and it's all online, and we're just trying to create a constant feed and something that people can connect with, see us, that we can be part of people's lives, because we're used to having 3-4 sessions a week, a lot of time where we spend together, and that's all out the door right now.
Yeah, funnily enough, when I did a previous podcast with the priest at St. Nicholas Parish, he was saying how community is one of those things that's so important, for religion, and religion aside, but for martial arts practitioners, community is so important as well.
That is almost like a religion for a lot of the people that practice martial arts. It's a home. It's I think a lot of religion speaks to a grounding, to a community, to an extension of your family, and that's the way that martial arts is for me, and I'm sure it is for a lot of people. It is that way of connecting with a broad range of people.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, well, let's we'll talk about your jiu-jitsu journey at some point in this conversation, but let's bring it all back. Let's talk about, where did you grow up, Aaron?
So Goulburn originally, and then when was I, year 2, maybe 10 years old, we moved to Camden. My dad was suffering with the cold, and he was getting chilblains on his fingers, and he was working a truck driving job, and they're like, you need to move to a warmer climate. So
really,
we moved towards Sydney, and that's where I did most of my growing up. So between Goulburn and Camden.
Okay, so Goulburn is the home of the Big Merino.
Yes, it is.
And Camden is southwest Sydney, probably about an hour and a half out of the city, by car obviously. But do you remember much about what life was like in Goulburn? Obviously, if you were there only when you were 2, I don't know if you'd remember.
Oh
much.
No, I was there till I was in year 2. So
in year 2,
I would have been, I don't know, I think 9 or maybe 9 or 10 years old, something like that. 7. Because you do kindy at 6.
Okay. Yeah.
7.
Okay.
8,
maybe. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Probably 8 years old.
Yeah.
I have a lot of memories of Goulburn, and the house that we grew up in was originally their parents' house, and my dad took over a wrecking yard that his dad had built up, which was called Frank's, which was that's my dad's name. So it was a big wrecking yard opposite where we lived. So there was the highway that ran through Goulburn was basically between our house, and then you'd walk across the road up a little hill, and you'd walk up to the wrecking yard. So we were really close to home. It was a bit of a crazy house because they were right into Speedway, and it had 4 garages built onto it. 2 of them were for racing cars.
Yep.
It had a big giant driveway, which was for 3 trucks, because they ended up doing all the pickups of cars that were in smashes between Sydney and Canberra.
Oh, wow.
So they had a big,
Storage
contract with so there were 3 trucks in our driveway, and there were race cars, and we were on like 2 acres of land, and then we had this wrecking yard across the road that was also this big giant space that just kind of existed.
Yep. Well, so yeah, I've been to Goulburn quite a few times, obviously, you know, because I'm into my cars, and used to go down with a whole bunch of mates to Wakefield all the time. And
so Wakefield that's my mum's side of the family actually sold part of their land, which is the Pelican Sheep Station, to build that racetrack.
No way.
So
okay.
yeah, it's
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So you know, from here to Wakefield is probably a good 2.5 hours drive. But you know, I guess from a driving perspective, if you haven't been on a racetrack before, it's probably one of the safer tracks to drive on, just because there's not a lot of obstacles that you could hit. Of course, bar maybe the final hairpin, where, you know, I've seen many a person get pretty close to the tyre wall there.
That's the tightest corner of the track.
Yeah.
You come right around to the end. So I guess to speak to that, like, there were always race cars in my family. The family lent towards Speedway, and my grandfather actually built the Goulburn Speedway. So there's all this like interlacing of crazy car stuff, but rallying, bikes, go-karts, all of that stuff. My family's always been right into the car world.
Yep.
Hasn't necessarily washed off on me in quite the same way, but it is definitely part of the Nicastri bloodline.
Okay. So then, changing in year 2, so you would have had, I guess, been a little bit aware of your surroundings, obviously, by that age, right? And then, so you would have changed schools.
Yep.
In year 2 as well. Do you remember much of what that was like? Was that, you know, was it easy? Did you find it difficult?
So it was difficult. It was so I had some early learning kind of problems.
Mm-hmm.
I was like semi-autistic in some of the things that I did when I was quite young. Like, I used to I would write, and you'd be able to read some of my books like read them forwards when you put them in a mirror. And I had a lot of difficulties with coordination and basic motoring skills.
Wait, so let's go back to that. So you would write things, but you'd need to read them in a mirror.
Yeah, so I have some books where I've written things, and you put it in a mirror and you read it forwards. So whatever connections were going on with my brain with how to write and how to interpret things were not normal. My mum
is that but like, did your parents ever, you know, take you somewhere to get diagnosed, or?
Yeah, so my mum picked up on this really early. So when I was in year 1, I think it was, I did a year of, basically my mum pulled me out of school for a couple of hours to go and do like one-on-one, I guess, teaching, like learning at a special center. I'm not sure exactly what it was or exactly what they diagnosed me with, but basically they worked on my motoring skills, like catching balls, jumping, skipping. They made me go and do ballet class to learn how to skip.
Really? Okay. So were these things that you did? Were you struggling with those things?
Yeah.
So from a motor skills perspective, you actually had
I really just, I had probably motoring skills that were probably 2 to 3 years behind my age.
Wow. Okay.
And it's funny because I kind of, from this process of doing this extra schooling and this extra studying, and they sent me extra homework, and I just kind of grew a drive to get good at things, and I got a lot of strong feedback loop through this whole time, and it kind of, I guess, set in motion a template for me being able to work hard at things and realizing that there would be rewards. The reward I got at the end of doing the year of school, my parents, they used to go up to Bathurst each year for the big Bathurst race, the V8 supercar race. And there's this big, like, giant, I don't know, it's almost like a mansion that's on the inside of the track.
Okay.
And they bring people in, and basically they run like an all-day barbecue, like pigs on spits and other stuff, and alcohol and food, and they just run this huge extravagant day that runs across the whole race meeting.
Yep.
So you get to like the venue, I don't know, probably like 6 or 7 in the morning, like 2-3 hours before the races start, and they just start like drinking and eating meat and cooking things, and it just runs for
the whole time.
The whole time. And you have pit access because you're on the inside of the track, so you walk straight down into the pits and you walk back up, and you have this unique view of the track, and it's
everything that's happening.
It's basically like 50 people is what they cap it at in this house, and so it's like this pretty cool thing. And my parents basically took one of us each year with them to this thing, because I've got 3 brothers and sisters, and, you know, trying to take 4 kids to this crazy expensive thing that we're probably not going to get that much value out of. It's pretty intense, but yeah, they took me up the year that I ended that as a like kind of reward for the hard work that I'd done.
Yep. And was that like, I guess when you think back on that experience, was that like, you know, completely eye-opening, or like were you just amazed at everything that happened, or was it?
The sound is really loud.
Yeah.
The sound of the
scared?
cars. No, I think I was old enough that I wasn't scared, and I've been around Speedway so much that like cars making lots of noise was fine by me. But, you know, I think it was the first time I'd actually seen a pig on a spit going around. So there's a whole bunch of experiences, and then there's a whole bunch of like adults just kind of getting drunk and having this like, you know, it's a really strange experience, but it was really cool, and it, you know, goes back to a bit of a time before, I guess, the rules were strongly enforced at any kind of big meeting and big gathering, like it's before 9/11 and all that kind of time, when we're pretty easygoing, I think, comparatively to how we go about our day-to-day lives now.
Yep. So, so over time, like in that, after you'd gone to those extracurricular activities to try and work on those motor skills and things like that, did that then, like, those issues just sort of, you know, disappeared, or did you still have some struggles with that throughout the rest of schooling?
So I was always ahead on maths, behind on English, and then the motoring skills just kept picking up, because when I went to a new school, so in Goulburn we had heaps of space and everybody played soccer, football, whatever, you know, every lunch break you'd go and you'd play sport. When I got to a new school, it was a concrete jungle and everybody just played handball.
Okay.
Handball.
Yep.
And obviously your stature and your worth as a kid in that school was basically how good at handball you were.
Yep.
And I just went home with the tennis ball and against our brick wall at the back, just played handball for hours and hours and hours.
Yep. Trying to get good at it.
Yeah, so it ended up translating into really picking up my hand-eye coordination, which I later ended up playing. Like, I played a bunch of soccer the whole time, but I ended up playing tennis through most of my adolescence, and that eye-hand coordination really just came from me just wanting to be good at handball, basically. Yep. It was just, you know, as soon as there was a driver, I could just lock in and just do the one thing, and I've kind of always been able to lock on to the one thing that I want to spend all my time and energy in, and just get better and better at it.
Did your parents, like, I guess, you know, when you're there, you know, banging away at the wall, you know, with a tennis ball for hours on end, I'm sure, did your parents ever go, hey, you know, take it easy? Or, like, you know, perhaps we should get into something else? Or
no, so
or they just let you
so
go?
My dad was less present during a lot of a lot of the time from when we moved, and that basically had to do with so when we moved from Goulburn to Camden, we went on this like 2-week holiday, and the idea was that we'd go on this holiday, and then we'd get to Camden, and my dad was going to open some new businesses, basically some new wrecking yards with his dad.
Yep.
During this 2-week period that we went on this holiday, my dad's dad passed away of a heart attack.
Oh, wow.
And so, like, my dad was really close with his dad, and his dad was, he was an immigrant. He'd come from Italy at the end of World War II. He'd kind of built him. He was like a self-made man, and
Yep. Started from nothing, basically.
yeah, started from nothing, built up to a business, owned the first 24-hour petrol station in Marulan, between Sydney and I think it might have even been between Sydney and Melbourne at the time. It was the first 24-hour petrol station that opened.
Wow.
And that's how they ended up, because they were open all these hours, they started to get a few trucks, and they were helping people out with, the crash and things that would happen along the highway. And they ended up with NRMA getting the contract for picking up all the crashes that happened along the highway. And, there's some pretty horrific stuff that happens,
Of course.
there, and pretty horrific stuff that they saw. From there, because they were picking up the smash cars, they started to build a small wrecking yard.
Yeah. So
Because they were getting all the cars, and then the cars had to go somewhere, and they were like, well, we will buy some of these cars.
Yep.
And so they started a wrecking yard. They started a second wrecking yard in Goulburn that was much bigger. And then he ended up starting a third wrecking yard in Sydney. And when he started the third wrecking yard in Sydney and Smithfield, he left the business in Goulburn to my dad. And because they moved to Sydney, it had freed up the house that they were living in, which ended up being our house.
Yep.
So my dad and his dad were hugely tight, and also had all these business plans and all these life plans. And sometimes, like, when your dad is a really big figure in a community, is really important. Like, his funeral had, I think, like 2,000 people at it.
Wow.
And it was like one of the big kind of funerals where you have the massive procession, and you kind of the thing that happens, that happens for like, if somebody in Parliament dies or something like that, that was the kind of...
Like a state funeral?
Yeah, it was kind of like that. So he had kind of been the person that led the wrecking game for Australia. He'd brought over a hotline system as well from America, which was essentially just a way that all the wrecking yards started to communicate. He did a deal with Telstra where basically they all got a phone line in that was a single connection, and it was super high technology at the time. Like, nobody was doing this. So he brought this system from America, convinced Telstra to do it, and then he'd put it in like 200 yards and was the center of this network. And so he just built this like massive presence and was really important in Australia, and still is. Like, a lot of people, there's still a memorial. There's a memorial race for him. There's a memorial thing that they do with all the wrecking yards. They do this big giant conference every year, and so he's still, it's over 25 years since he passed away, and everybody still knows his name in Goulburn. Yep. Everybody still knows who Frank Nicastri is. And, so when he passes away and you kind of underneath that person, it's hard for you to kind of come out and be your own man. And I think my dad really struggled in all that time because, his father had passed, and he was kind of reliant on him in a way to, give his life the next steps and the next choices. And so in that time, he still had my dad had all these strong connections with NRMA. He grabbed grabbed a truck driving job, and basically did 3 runs of picking up smash cars from Wollongong and taking them into Smithfield, into the main port of the NRMA for all the crashed cars. And so he did 3 runs back and forth. By the time you pick up, I think his truck took 3 or 4 cars at a time. By the time you do that 3 times in a day, it's 10, 11, 12-hour days.
Yep.
And he did that, 5 days a week for 6, 7 years. So that's the time basically from when I'm 8 through to when I'm 13.
Yeah.
And so in that time, I didn't spend a heap of time with my dad, and he kind of dropped off. I think he was probably quite depressed and quite upset, and there were several other things that happened across this time. But I think that's a big part of not really having a father figure so much across that time, and not for a lack of him loving me or caring for me. He always provided, and he had a very good job and a very stable income. There was never any fear of us not being provided for in any way. But as an emotional support and as a father, it very much changed, and I know that it changed.
Do you think that was he, after your grandfather had passed, was he, I guess, chasing that shadow of his dad still? Like, was he trying to fill those shoes, or was it more that he felt a bit overwhelmed by it? And so was the truck driving, I guess, in conjunction with the wrecking yards, obviously, or did he go a different pathway altogether and sort of left those businesses alone after that?
No, he ended up opening his own wrecking yard basically when I was 13, 14.
Yeah.
So he didn't completely go away from that thing. He did always like having control.
Yep.
But he wasn't the same entrepreneur. He wasn't the same, super ambitious, super driven guy. He probably needed more of a push to get there.
Yeah.
So his younger brother was that guy and took over the big business in Smithfield and other bits and pieces. So, there wasn't ever a rivalry between my dad and his younger brother, but he just wasn't driven in the same way. I don't think he was ever truly a businessman, but he definitely liked to have control of his environments. I don't know if I answered the question or I went off kilt.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess, so out of your siblings, right, what are you the oldest, or whereabouts do you sit?
So I have an older brother, a twin sister, and a younger brother.
Okay. So you're basically
right in the middle. I'm slightly older than my twin sister, so, I've got to say upper middle.
Upper middle. And so what's the age gap between you and the older brother?
Year and a half.
Okay. So, so he would have been quite young at the same time. So you're all basically going through this thing together.
Yep.
And what's the time?
So I think I would have been right at the end of year 2. He would have been right at the end of year 4. He was put forward, so he was always like the young and the smallest guy in his year. But he was also put forward because he was super intelligent and just took to school, ducked to water. He ended up being one of those kids that hates school because he's kind of too good at it.
Yep.
And isn't challenged. Exactly. That was never really my problem because I started kind of with a natural handicap.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that though, because when I actually think about, if you were to ask an adult to write something that you would then have to read in a mirror, like an adult will find that challenging.
Yep.
So in some ways, I think that's almost there's some genius in that.
Yeah, definitely it runs along with, it's close to an autistic thing. And I'm not sure what the correlation is completely there, but there's plenty of autistic people which are well above the bell curve.
Yep.
In how they understand how they operate in the world, but they operate from a quite different space.
Yeah, they view things in a different way, right? Like,
different lens.
I think sometimes people would comment that I have a certain intensity, to how I like to approach things, that, would be borderline obsessive. Like I think I've got an addictive personality.
Single-mindedness.
Yeah.
It makes you very good at the things that you do, but also I
the
almost
detriment
imagine
of
it like,
everything
it like blacks out the rest of your existence or the rest of the things going on around you. And sometimes that's to your detriment because, your family is fading off, or your friendships, or a bunch of other things, because you're obsessed with, whatever it is. And it might be a game, it might be a martial art, it could be any one single thing that you're focusing on. For me, at some point, it was definitely handball.
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
That ability to zone in, I think, is valuable, but it's hard to not just zone in when you have that type of personality.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the, I think everything in moderation, including moderation. That's the,
Yeah.
that's the I guess the famous catchphrase for it. But I often look back because, for a long period of my life, I was, obsessed with Kung Fu. And, my wife, would give me crap about this all the time. But, even after my first child was born, within basically a week, I was back at training. And, I look back on it and I don't regret any of it, because I think, it's one of those things where when you get to a certain level in those pursuits, you can see things that can translate to other things, So, yes, it's very single-minded to go down that one particular pursuit. And I can say, like when I think back on...
Do you think of it like the levels of teaching where basically they talk about the top of a hierarchy is the ability to understand and be able to teach, and like the lower levels are like understanding but not being able to teach, and then below that it's trying to understand.
Yeah, well, there's that I guess in business, like we always have this thing where they talk about the steps where the lowest tier would be unconscious incompetence.
Yeah, that's basically exactly the thing I was talking about.
Yeah, and then the next step would be conscious incompetence, where now it's like, okay, I'm now become more aware of what I actually don't know, and then the next step is to trying to get to conscious competence, where you actually know what you don't know, and then you actually now are starting to understand the whole thing.
Yep.
And then, I guess when it comes to formulating habits, getting to that upper tier of, being unconsciously competent at something.
The articulate way of saying the thing that I was saying.
Well, I actually call that last tier like the complacency step, because you get to this point where you become complacent.
Yep.
Because if you're unconsciously competent at it, then you're not really challenging yourself anymore.
Yep.
So I personally don't like to get to that stage. I think, once you get to that stage, you need to find new things to put in with it.
Then it's often teaching, because teaching forces you to communicate with all the lower tiers.
Yeah, you got to reflect.
You find that people get a lot better at the things that they're doing the second they start teaching, because it forces them to relearn, to reinforce the knowledge that they have, to really deal with it from different perspectives, different ideas. In jiu-jitsu, it's different body types. It's different people that move differently, think differently. It's a way of communicating. In other areas, it's obviously very different, but it's following that same kind of path of being able to basically communicate really well.
Yep.
What you're thinking, what you're feeling, what you're doing, so that people get it. And sometimes that's the hardest thing, especially when you're good at things. So I find one of the things that I have that I think is a handicap in some ways, but a benefit in another. I'm not the most natural guy at a lot of things. Like, it will take me some more reps than, let's say, it takes David to get to a point where he's competent with a movement. And that's because he's a very natural, very good mover. And other people do this. They come in and they'll get things quicker than I do. And that's okay. I learn it kind of the hard way through more steps. And I think when you go through that process, as well as it giving you an empathy for the other people that are struggling, it also helps you communicate more readily all those like little steps that it takes, because you need to take the little steps yourself. You can't just jump from point A to point E. You need B, C, D. And sometimes I find it hard when I'm receiving information and the person is good and they're easily able to jump from A to E, and they expect that I'm always on the same wavelength. And sometimes I might not need all the points. Maybe I can go A, C, E. But it's just different, right? And you need to go back to the further state when somebody's starting and somebody's learning. You need to show them A, B, C, D, E, because you can't expect that they know any of the information. And so sometimes our struggles with things help us be better at delivering information or understanding what information to deliver. And I think everybody has unique things to teach because of their own experiences and their own way of interpreting and dealing with the world.
Yeah. Well, I think that's, and you would have found this when you started to assist in teaching jiu-jitsu, that your understanding of things is now challenged on a different level. You have to work out different ways that you can articulate it depending on who you're speaking to, whether it's you're teaching a kid's class or you're teaching an adult's class. There's certain movements which, there's different ways of articulating the movement, whether it's, a hand position, or sometimes it's not so much about talking about the specific hand position, but what is the underlying concept beneath that, right? When I spent a lot of time, teaching Kung Fu as well, and, I was fortunate enough to start assisting with teaching probably about maybe 5-6 years into my Kung Fu journey. And then I think that helped me, throughout the rest of that, because, I've taught, had to teach, people with learning difficulties, like, people with Down syndrome, autism, and they were doing it to obviously improve their motor skills and that kind of a thing. And, I've like lots of kids from, ages of 4 and up, and they learn very differently, and you can't, expect them to grasp concepts when all they're trying to do is copy.
Learning gross motoring.
Yeah.
I guess, so my experience, at least of jiu-jitsu, if I'm to talk more specifically of this part of my life, which for me has been about a 10-year journey at this point. So I started under Thiago Braga out of Legacy. He was a Roots gym, which was initially what our gym was. That's just an affiliation, one of the big affiliations for jiu-jitsu in Australia.
So back many years ago, there would have only been like Roots and Gracie Humiata. Oh, well, Roots was the original, wasn't it? One of the original.
Yeah, Roots was one of the originals. There was some Gracie. There was a mix of schools and options when I came into it. But I think I just probably went to the one that was nearest to me that made the most sense. There wasn't heaps and heaps of gyms at the time. So I trained at Legacy or Roots for a bit over a year, maybe closer to a year and a half. I did my first competition, and I was going along the path. I think I was probably like a 2-stripe white belt, maybe a 3-stripe white belt, somewhere around there. So what that meant at that time was a very different thing to what it means now as well, because we're in a developing sport. So I don't expect that it translates to the same thing that it is now. We have better learning materials. We have better information.
The methodologies have all upgraded.
But I was at a point where I'd started to invest a bunch of time and a bunch of energy into jiu-jitsu, and I was liking it and enjoying it. And then I got quite ill, and I couldn't work out what was going on. And so I went to my GP, and they took some blood tests, and they also checked my heartbeat, and they found 2 things. So the blood test showed that I had glandular fever.
Okay.
which if anybody's ever had glandular fever, hasn't had glandular fever, explaining it is kind of like you've got 3 or 4 hours of energy a day.
Yeah.
And that's just for like getting by. Like you're not doing anything hard in that time. And then you're essentially sleeping for the rest of the day. And, you know, so I was 25 at the time and I had glandular fever. Basically knocked me out for close to a year before I started to return to good energy levels.
Yeah.
The other thing that they found is they found that I had a heart murmur, which they ended up sending me to cardiologists and all the rest of things. And they found out that I had a leaking valve, mitral valve prolapse is what I have. And the first recommendation I got from the cardiologist, so I've just found out like in the last week that I have glandular fever and my life's going to be basically hell for a year.
Yep.
And the cardiologist goes, you have this leaking valve, and it's not a thing that people have generally that are young. And so he gave me a recommendation that he would give to somebody that's probably 50 or 60 that comes in. And he recommended that I do no isometric exercises for the rest of my life, that I basically stop doing anything that's intense fitness-wise that could put me under stress.
Yeah.
And so the combination of those two things was a lot. And so I suspended my jiu-jitsu membership and decided to pull back. At the time, they put you on like a running test. They basically want to check your fitness level. And with glandular fever, I still ran the entire thing. It's like this 20-minute test where they link you up with all these
Electrodes.
heart monitors and electrodes and stuff.
Yep.
I can't remember the exact name of it right now.
Wasn't it
was stress eco.
Stress, okay.
Yeah, so they got me to run a stress eco, and I ran the whole thing.
Yep.
And like that's not a thing that happens. Basically anything, so it runs for 20 minutes. If you do anything over 15 minutes, they start to talk of you as like military personnel and, you know,
so you're still
like
fit.
high level fitness.
Yep.
So this like led me stopping doing jiu-jitsu for a year. I moved out of the city from where I was training, went to live with one of my mates out towards Penrith. And yeah, I was that was basically my year at 25 was like low energy and living out of the city and not doing any jiu-jitsu.
So were you working at that time, or what were you doing?
I was playing online poker at that time.
Online poker?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll come back to that. We'll finish
come back to that, and we'll come back to, there's some other stuff. There's some stories.
We'll go back, yep. So.
Okay. So I spend this year, and basically my energies start to come back. I start to feel good again, and I find a new cardiologist that I end up moving through a few cardiologists until eventually I find the person that really gets me, and that we're on basically the same wavelength.
Yep.
And I decide after a year, like, I want to live my life. And this runs in exactly the same time that David opens up a location. So a new gym opens and they take Roots as their jiu-jitsu, and David takes that as the head instructor.
Yep. And
so I show up on day one at this like open gym space that's happening for Roots. And I walk in with my gear and my bag and my belt with its 2 stripes, and I'm ready to roll. And I'm like, where do I sign up?
Yep. And
so nobody was ready for anybody to come in. David didn't know what a PaySmart form was. You know, there was none of the. He was like shocked that somebody had shown up, and like I was ready to go. Like I thought we'd be rolling on the mats that day.
Yeah. And he's still in setup mode.
Yeah, this is the story of how I became the first student of ICC.
Yeah.
And it was this crazy day because the guys that opened up this gym were clearly affiliated with some kind of bike gangs, and
Oh, okay.
and yeah, it was just it was insane. There was like choppers everywhere and a crazy barbecue and Serbian alcohol that they'd made themselves. And, like it was insane.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so that was the start of me rejoining jiu-jitsu.
So you didn't get to roll that day?
I did not get to roll that day, but I came back feeling good and feeling that I wanted to do jiu-jitsu with my life. And even though I've been told that I shouldn't,
Yeah.
I gave all that information, obviously, to David and Stephen and said, I want to train, I want to compete, I want to do these things. I'm cleared by my doctor, not by my cardiologist, but, that wasn't the cardiologist that aligned with me.
Yeah.
And yeah, I straight away came into a leadership role because I was the only one with experience except David, Stephen, and the other people that had caught in. Everybody was a brand new student. So David had me running warm-ups probably like a month after we started.
Yep.
When he decided that, he didn't need to run every single warm-up. So that was the start of my journey, and also the start of like kind of the second part of my journey, and also a choice that I made that I wanted to stick with jiu-jitsu, and that, I think eventually all martial artists are told at some point that there's reasons that they shouldn't continue for basically health concerns.
Yeah.
I think that's something that happens that we all have to deal with, and then we have to moderate our behavior around the advice that we're given. But if you love something, like, it's not really an option just to stop.
Yeah, that's right. You got to find a way around it, because I've always, like, if it's something that you're truly passionate about, the question is always, are you actually living, or you're just slowly dying? Because you can choose to not do things that you resonate with and you enjoy, then, are you going to be living a fulfilled life? And if these things are providing you with some kind of fulfillment, well, generally there should be ways to work around any sort of, handicap or, disability or something like that, so that you can still engage in those things. Like, injuries are a massive part of any martial art or any contact sport. So it's, so there's different schools of thought on it. Like my sort of thinking on it is always, if you're going to learn how to hurt people, you should also have some understanding of how to heal people.
Yeah.
So, and even if you're not doing that, in terms of a job, like I don't go and treat people and things like that, but at least if I can understand enough so that, I can work on myself or treat myself, how to, what's the right methodology for my body, because everybody's different as well. Some people, when you're younger, like, you can probably walk through injuries and not really feel it as much. But as you get older, those things will add up.
Well, I think you also just get reps. So if you get hurt and you do shoulder injuries and you do leg injuries, and you learn each time from how you're treated, what the exercises are, and you also learn in a group because everybody's experiencing these things. And we often come back to training while we're still injured, and we protect our injuries. So, like, when just after I got my blue belt, so I competed a whole bunch at white belt, I basically followed the mantra that I wanted jiu-jitsu to be an important part of my life. And just after I got my blue belt, I tore my meniscus in my right knee.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't through doing any crazy exercise or carrying any crazy amount of load. It was basically just because that area of my body was weak, and just training jiu-jitsu on its own will not make your body strong enough to deal with all of the stress and punishment that happens. It's a combination of your fitness, you're working your stretch and mobility, everything to make sure that your body is capable of handling the load.
Yeah.
And because a lot of the load is like essentially like pulling and rounding our shoulders in, and it's doing movements that are similar, we're going to be rotating one way all the time. So we're then weak the opposite way. You can't just do one exercise, one type of exercise, and expect that to solve all of your problems.
Yeah, it depends where you're starting from too, right? Like if you're coming from a level where you haven't been doing anything, of course you're going to experience a gain when you pick up any sort of sport or athletic endeavor or martial arts or jiu-jitsu or anything, right?
Yep.
But then, if you continue on that journey, you're going to get to a certain point where you're going to receive diminishing returns, right? And that's where you've got to now, if you can achieve a certain level of fitness by doing this kind of activity, then now you need to challenge your bodies in other ways so that you can, keep it strong, or like even think of it as prehab, right? Like preventative maintenance to prevent the injuries, right?
Yeah, and there's plenty of that. So when I injured myself, I ended up having 2 operations on my knee to actually deal with that. One of the things I didn't do was I didn't stop my membership. I'd already decided that I was doing jiu-jitsu and it was an important part of my life, and it was a way of me telling myself that I'm coming back, that I'm not stopping. Because the first time when I pulled out, when I got all this bad news that I had glandular fever and that I had this heart thing and I couldn't do basically anything for the rest of my life, and I'm a 25-year-old fit guy at this time, is like, it's just not realistic information. It's not a realistic approach to how you're going to live a life. And it was probably also really hard for that cardiologist to understand my perspective and give me advice that was reasonable for me, because it's a unique situation.
That's right.
Yeah.
So then you pretty much just followed Dave from that point forward, right?
Yeah. So I think the whole way through, once I came under Dave, I just decided that he was my coach and he was my guy. And the original setup that we had, I was living in Penrith. I was working in Narellan, so I'd drive there in the morning and then I'd go to Liverpool to train. Mm-hmm. And it was like a round circuit that I'd do each day, and that was fine. It was like 20 minutes from work when I finished work, and worked really well. Then David decided that he was going to leave Platinum was the gym, and he was going to actually open up his own gym. And he put it in Peakhurst, which, is another 25 minutes up the road and not really convenient. So I was now doing this big round trip of Penrith to Narellan to Peakhurst back to Penrith.
Yep.
4 times a week.
Yep.
And that didn't really stop me from doing the things. I just put audiobooks on and listened to every episode of This American Life, and there wasn't all the great jiu-jitsu podcasts that now exist. Yep. So I was unfortunate in that part of I couldn't continue my jiu-jitsu learning while I was driving, but you take what you can get.
Yeah, that's right. It's a good opportunity like that, and that's the thing. Like a lot of people look at travel as a hindrance. I did a lot of travel through my working career, because at one stage I was working for Toyota head office, which is in Caringbah, and my role was an area manager. So I used to travel a lot to see dealerships. And when you get into that area manager capacity, the first thing, you generally end up in a rural area. So I had the northern region, or the northern run, which basically was from my closest dealer would have been in the Hunter, so Newcastle, Maitland, Cessnock, that area, and then all the way up to Coffs Harbour, and and then west towards Tamworth, Gunnedah, like those sorts of areas, and then that was basically like this northern sort of loop that I used to do, and I had a very similar thing to you, because I was living in the hills, which is northwest of Sydney, driving to work, which is in Caringbah, and then travelling back to Kung Fu class, whether it was in Balcombe Hills, whether it was in Cabramatta, whether it was in Beecroft, because we had multiple different locations. So, and I was going to pretty much all the classes, so I was across that. And then, and then doing these crazy runs on a monthly basis, right? On a weekly basis, actually. So, the way that you sort of divide it is, you know, you'd go to maybe your dealers in the Hunter and do a loop, you know, just from the 4 dealers in the Hunter and come back to Sydney. And then the next week you'd do up to Coffs Harbour and back. Yep. And then the following week you do the Tamworth loop.
And then by the end of a month, you'd knock
seen
off
more.
everyone. And
exactly.
Yeah, and then you'd be back to starting your loop again.
Yeah. But the thing was with my loop was that, see, most people would just go, I'm gone for the week. And they were okay to stay.
Yeah, they'd stay in a hotel or whatever, right?
Yeah.
You'd come back so you could train.
Yeah. I'd basically had my loop set up so that, you know, I had a window from, so I had class on Tuesdays. I had class on Fridays, Saturdays, Sundays. Yep. So basically it was like Monday was my office day, Tuesday I'd train, and then sometimes like I even used to leave after training on a Tuesday to go and drive somewhere. So, you know, at I guess the height of my obsession, I would do the Tuesday class and then drive. One night I did drive all the way to Tamworth that night. So I basically left the class at like 11, drove to Tamworth, and I couldn't book into the hotel actually because I booked into the Quest Apartments, which are there. Yep. And then obviously being Quest Apartments, there isn't somebody at the counter the whole time, right? So here I was at, you know, I don't know, 4 a.m. or something, ringing the buzzer, had a very grumpy, you know, manager who was on site come and give me the keys. But that was what I used to do. And then I'd, you know, sleep for a few hours, get up, do my visit, and then start my run, and then make my way back to Sydney. You know, and you don't really think about it when you're doing it because you're still driving so much enjoyment out of what you do.
Yep.
Right. And then so like you get a lot of time in the car, but then that time, you know, for me, originally, you know, didn't have podcasts and things like that either. It was just either music or sometimes.
But you start to fill it with more value.
Yeah.
Because you realize that it's time that you're spending. I think for a while I was going through classic books. So I was listening to Dickens and I was listening to Jane Austen's and I was just making sure that I at least had listened to a book of every major author that, you know, I kind of understood. And I'm not a massive reader, so I probably wouldn't have done that on my own.
Yep.
But if I'm in a car in the space and it was easy, just press play on a thing, I can do that.
Yep.
That's so simple, and that was a good way for me to interact and just build, you know, that knowledge. That there's no reason, you know, you're trying to make all of your time valuable in some way, and it doesn't need to be hugely valuable to the rest of your life. Like, you know, knowing a story is not going to add a heap of value, but it also, you know, it's ties to other people, it's ties to other communities, it's understanding of, you know, it comes up so often that people are making little crosslinks of things that are going on, and they're relating to their stories, or they're relating to things that they don't even know they're relating to. Yeah. And that's just, you know, a way that we communicate, and a way that we better communicate when our knowledge base is expanded.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing that I, you know, once I discovered podcasts, the thing that I love so much about it was that you're getting different perspectives and it's not confronting in the sense, like if you're having a discussion with a group of people and you're involved in the discussion and somebody offers an alternate view, you know, rather than actually taking the time to listen, you might go and speak and chime in with your opinion before you've actually heard the full opinion, right? Or the full perspective. And then when you listen to a podcast, you listen to another person's conversation, there's no opportunity for you to buck up and say, hey, I disagree with this, or hey, I disagree with that. Your only option is to switch it off, right? Yep. So
opt out.
Yeah, to opt out, right? But then through doing that, then I think that promotes that level of open-mindedness, or that ability to at least listen through somebody else's perspective. You know, whether it's something political or an ideology that you may not agree with, you've only got two options. You either listen to it or you opt out. But if it's something that if you're enjoying the conversation, and I think that's what then helps people become a bit more broad-minded when it comes to, you know, people who might have a particular leaning in terms of their, you know, their perspectives. But then if you take the time to actually listen, that might actually shape your perspective on it. And like, you know, even just from my own podcast that I've done, like I'm not, you know, massively religious. Like I always say that I'm probably leaning more towards the agnostic side, but you know, when I did that podcast with Father Chris, you know, he's just such a down to earth guy, and so like everything seems like it was from such an authentic place that you know, to me he's a great asset for religion, or what, you know, religion is supposed to be about.
What it offers.
Yeah.
You know, which is community,
Yep.
family, a way to live your life and interact in the world that isn't just governed by the laws of your country. It's governed by some ideals.
Yeah, yeah, and I think, you know, especially in, you know, in times like we're currently in, where there's all this, you know, uncertainty, and there's a lot of anxiety at the moment. You know, it sounds crazy, you know, but like, even like, you know, that the warmth, and because of what I do for work, you know, it's so odd for me to not shake people's hands. Right? And I feel rude by not doing it. But, you know, I understand the reasons why we can't do that anymore. You know, we've got to be safe, and, you know, practice social distancing, and, you know, do our bit, so that, you know, and likewise, like, I haven't, you know, visited my parents, you know, in months, because, you know, I don't want to run the risk.
They're probably older, like all of our parents. We're all mid-30s or getting 40s, you know, like our parents are that next generation.
Yep.
It's part of our duty is to protect them, to not expose them to our circles. So, you know, it makes sense that we don't go and interact, even though, you know, we really want to, and it's really important.
Yep. So, all right, let's go back a bit now. So we'll come back to jiu-jitsu again when we talk about, you know, the space that we're in. So high school, what was that like?
So I went to high school at John Terry Catholic School, which is co-ed Catholic school. I would say that high school wasn't particularly great for me. I would say that I was still catching up to the curve the whole time. In some areas I was ahead, in other areas I was behind. But it put me in all the lower classes. And because we were, Rose Meadow, just to give you guys a bit of a grounding, is a large area of housing commission, essentially. So you've got this Catholic school, which is private, next to all this housing commission. And because it's a Catholic school, it is actually our fees and things, as like a lot of the paying students, actually they used to fund bringing in people from the housing commission that were Catholic, and that the parents wanted to bring them in. So you had this like huge mix of worlds, and kind of this rougher school than you would think for a Catholic co-ed private school.
Yep.
Just based upon where it was and what it was. I would say that for a large part, the schooling system in a lot of ways probably let me down and wasn't very, very useful and good for me in an overall, when I look at what I got out of it and where my confidence across my life has been built. I think it's hard to do school. So my older brother, he got kicked out of the school for having a small amount of marijuana.
Okay.
You know, they didn't find him with marijuana, but somebody reported, and, you know.
Okay.
So he got kicked out about 2 weeks after we got accepted in.
Yep.
So we came to this school as kind of tags as like bad kids, and I came in with my twin sister, and trying to share a space with a twin when you're very different people. And like, I was a nerdy, small, shy kid who wasn't overly coordinated, and was okay sporting wise, but wasn't a star in any of my classes. Wasn't, what I had to offer. I think at that time in my life wasn't a lot, and like in some way, like when you think overall of, which kids are going to be the cool kids and which kids are going to fit in easily and how this is all going to work, I think I was destined to have a pretty hard time. And you know, I didn't really get along with my twin sister for most of our high school. There was already like a divide by the time we ended our primary school, and that just grew bigger and bigger through our adolescence.
And what do you think was the factor behind that?
I think my sister found me an inconvenience in some ways. And, you know, I think it's hard as kids, you know.
Trying to formulate your own personalities.
Yeah, you're trying to form your own personalities, and somebody's in your space and, you know, they're not the coolest kid, and it's kind of bringing you down, or, you know, your perspective can very much be that. And
shaped by your peers, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that that in some ways she probably felt some shame, or it was a way of distancing, or, you know, that she didn't want to be related or close to me, or, you know, any of those things. And bits of that carry across to our adult life and how we interact with each other. But I would say it would have been mostly her choices, not mine. And I don't love her any less for the fact that that I think at these times that she was probably less understanding and less able to be selfless, or to show a lot of empathy towards me while I was really struggling. And my older brother was in a similar thing. When he'd finished primary school, my parents sent him off to Goulburn to boarding school for a year because he was a nightmare. And the way that they explain it was they actually wanted to give space for myself, my twin sister, and my younger brother to have some space to breathe, where not every problem was about him.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, when I went back and I chatted with my parents about it, is that's actually the perspective that my mother had on it. She was like, the reason that we sent him away was mostly for you guys. It wasn't because we didn't think we could handle him. It was because it was unfair for you guys to get attention and love, and, you know, to have a childhood in a way that we think is ideal. So essentially my older brother went away for a year. He got sent to a boarding school in Goulburn, 100 and something boys. He obviously duxes the year where he's forced to do study and forced to be active and forced to engage. Hates it, absolutely hates it. And so as a reward, they're like, we'll come back and live at home. By the end of year 8, as we get accepted into this school, he gets kicked out for taking drugs to school. So he's still a bit of a problem kid. He's the kid that, you know, my dad spots driving the ute down the highway that was in front of our house in year 9.
Yeah.
You know, at, I don't know, what, 14, 15, driving a car down the highway. And he's driving up the other way, seeing his son driving. So, you know, he just always wanted to push the limits. Boundaries. And that was because he was bored and that he was super clever. And, you know, so basically that year when my brother went away, a lot of our bond as brothers fell away. So I didn't have a strong bond with my dad because he basically just worked all the time, and at the time he was right into Speedway, so all of his spare time was working on cars, and it actually like pushed me away from being interested in a lot of those things, or interested in him, because everything was work, and when he'd come home, he was still trying to deal with his own things. So I had my older brother, who then was kind of distanced from me, and my sister, who was distanced from me. My younger brother was great the whole time, but he was 3 years younger, probably a little bit too large of a gap. And then I was always really close with my mum. So she's, to this day, my big support network, and the person that I turn to for advice and help and, you know, emotional support and all those things. And so I guess I don't think that I was in the best spot as far as my home life during that period. I was also, as I explained, I was quite into nerdy stuff. I was into Warhammer, and I started to become into card games, and I was into computer games. And
play Magic?
Yes. So this ended up with me starting to play a game called Magic the Gathering, which is a collectible card game, basically like a blend between poker and chess, if I'm to explain it. And I got really, really good at this game, and so I started playing this in year 11. By year 12, I was going into the city playing in every big tournament that I could. And I found a network of people that are still
like-minded. Yep.
Like a lot of my strongest friends to this day, and a lot of my long-standing relationships now all come from this. And barely any, except for my twin sister, really go back to my school. Like, I'll see people in my feed, but I don't interact with anybody from that part of my life. It's not a part of my life where I found a lot of confidence, a lot of joy. It's, I look back on that time.
Yep.
It's not the best time in my life for me, and it was a bunch of factors, which some of them were out of my control. Some of them I wasn't yet competent enough to make good decisions for me, or to explain the things that were bad for me and what I actually needed. And I think the help would have been available if I could have expressed what I needed and what I wanted at those times in my life.
Yep.
So I guess the magic thing is it's going to bleed into poker, and it's going to bleed into a lot of things. Do you want me to?
Yeah, let's talk about magic. Because look, I played a little bit of magic as well. I think at our high school we got into it around year 7 or year 8. And we played a bunch, and then I don't know. Sort of for me, it then petered into more StarCraft and computer games. But
So I definitely carried on a bit longer with it. So 2002, I started playing this card game. By 2003, I'm in year 12, and I'm going to all these big tournaments. I keep playing for, I still am involved in the game, and I ended up owning a game store and some other bits and pieces. When would I have been? I would have been 22 or 23 when I won nationals for Magic.
yep.
So basically the biggest tournament in Australia, and I was flying around to some of the other states to play in tournaments, and I won invites to the Pro Tour, which are events all around the world for this card game. And they were free flight, free invite to this event that pays out a bunch of cash prizes.
Yep.
And so I did pretty well in combination in this year spot where I went, I want to take this magic thing seriously. And I've been working a casino job for 5 years, kind of between the time where I'd finished school and where I'd won nationals in Magic. So I'd kind of been in the sphere of games and other things in my life. But I'd won nationals, I'd won this other event, and I'd been to a Magic Pro Tour, and I'd done pretty well. I think I finished maybe 30th out of 300 or something like that. And that gave me invites to more things, and nationals gave me invites to more events. And so I decided I was going to do this trip, basically following the circuit of Pro Tours, and then they have events under them, which are called Grand Prix.
Yep.
And if you score enough points in those things, essentially what I was trying to win was a thing called Rookie of the Year, which is the newest comer to the Pro Tour who scores the most professional points.
Yep.
And that person got free invites to all the Pro Tours the next year. I think a $2,500 American appearance fee, and basically all the tournaments also paid money.
Yep.
So I went and I did this circuit, and I had some really cool things happen along this circuit. So I did all these events, and I did okay in quite a few of them.
So these events, you're in America, or?
We started, the first Pro Tour that I went to was in Los Angeles, and then I'd driven from there to Las Vegas and played poker for a few weeks and made a bunch of money on that trip, and got a tattoo and other bits and pieces. So, you know.
Hang on. And when you said you were working at a casino, so you were working at Star or?
Yeah, I was working at Star City. So I was a croupier.
For what game?
Blackjack, Baccarat, Roulette.
Okay.
And then I was dealing all the minor games and teaching, doing all the learn to play stuff. And, you know, I was moving along with that as a career, but it's also kind of terrible in a sense of, you know, that you're taking money from people. And basically, once I chose that I wanted to follow magic and I'd like handed in my resignation, it was the hardest work that I've ever done because I said that I would stay on for 3 months until I went to do
magic,
until I went to start playing these magic events. And I just felt like I was a smiling pokey.
Yep.
And I
You
really,
were hollow.
really started to hate it. And I'm like, why am I here?
Yep.
Why am, you know, and it kind of led to this realization. I'd gone from this point where I was really happy in the working environment and I was a really good employee. And basically I had asked work for the time off. I think I needed, for the trip I was going to do was 3 months and I had 2.5 months saved of leave.
Yep.
And I asked if I could do, if I could have 2 weeks unpaid leave, and they'd just gone, no, you cannot. And I was the captain for the Australian team, and I was going to represent Australia at Worlds, which was the end of these pro tours and things. So I kind of come to them with a package of all these things that I was doing. I'd been basically a spotless employee for the 3 or 4 years that I'd been there, like under 5 sick days in 3 years and things like that. Like I just showed up and did my job. Every shift. And it was then really hard. It really felt like some of the grounding had been pulled out from under me, and I just locked into magic being the thing that I wanted to do. So I went on this big trip. I started in, where did I start? I started in France, and I made a connection with a guy that had done very well previously in Marseille. And so I went from Paris down to Marseille, stayed with him for a few weeks, getting ready for a tournament, then came to Paris, played a tournament, went from Paris to Berlin, played another big tournament, went from Berlin over to America, arrived in America the night that Obama got elected. And I arrived in Atlanta, and Atlanta is a predominantly black city. And there was kind of just this vibe in the air. I don't know how to explain it. It was just electric. For the time and for those few days, it was, you know, this real feeling of things have changed and this real excitement, and it was pretty insane. And one of the experiences that I'll get to hold for my whole life is just being part of this bit of history. And for no reason, like I kind of just went over with a one-way ticket to France. So where I arrived in America was all just basically potluck.
Yep.
But yeah, really special moment. From America, I think I was in Atlanta, then we went somewhere else for another event, I think maybe Houston, and then we went from there to Japan. I stayed in a house with a whole bunch of magic players, a whole bunch of Japanese guys who were lovely for 2 weeks. Learned to use chopsticks because that was the only option.
Yep.
They all laughed at me as I was like fumbling my way around learning chopsticks and, you know, trying to eat in a reasonable amount of time.
Yep.
Played some tournaments, went to Singapore, went to New Zealand, back to America was the trip that I did. So it was like jump, basically for a 3-month period of place to place to place. In the last tournament coming into it, I was like nose and nose with another guy for player of the year. And basically each day you play a bunch of rounds. And so day one, I was one of 3 players that went undefeated in the field. And so I won all 6 rounds that we played that day. And then we had a teams element that we played. And the other 2 guys in my team, we're a 3-player team, did really well as well. So there was like a team element and an individual element. And so at the end of day one, Australia was like the top of the standings.
Wow.
Which was like Yeah, it was not an expected result. Like if you were a bookkeeper, you would have put us at like a 1% chance to be there. And it was a 3-day tournament, then leading into like a playoff kind of thing. Day 2, we came back and we played, and each day is a different format, different set of rules. Day 2 was not a good day for me. It was this thing of like where we start, and basically you get given cards, and you do a thing called drafting where you're picking and passing. You're taking the best cards to build the best deck that you can to play against other people. And I thought I did really well in the drafting portion, and then basically all of my games. It's still, Magic is a luck-based game. It's a skill and a luck-based game. Yep. You need both things to line up. Basically, I did really well in the drafting portion, and then in the games, everything that could go wrong just did go wrong. And so after the first draft, I had gone 0-3. So now my record for the tournament was 6-3. And we had this other team thing that was going on. The next draft, I'm pretty rocked by this. So I'm going from like sky high from day one to like
lowest of lows.
Lowest of lows. And it was also like felt really bad because I'd had such a good deck. Like I was like, on average, this deck does a minimum 2-1. Sometimes it will 3-0. So my expected result after the draft was to be at 8-1 or 9-0.
Yep.
From the 18 rounds, which is going to put you in a really likely spot.
So let's hit pause on the story here, because I guess when we talk about Magic, so it's not your own cards that you're playing with. You're playing with basically you've got to pick your cards based on whatever is available. Or
so different days are different formats. So some of the days you would have built your own deck from a selection. So the way that it works is there's a pool of cards. So it might say you can play with all the cards that have been printed in the last 2 years.
Yep.
And that's one format. Another format might say you can play with all the cards that have been printed in the last 10 years.
Yep.
And that's another format. Then there's a unique format where you show up and you kind of get the cards on the day and you have to build from a really limited proportion of cards.
Yep.
So day 1 was kind of the 2-year thing.
Yep.
Day 2 was we get our cards on the day.
And does everybody build from the same cards available?
No, so what happens is you open up a bunch of cards, you take the card that you think is the best out of the pack, which has like 15 cards, pass them to your left and you receive 14 cards from the guy on your right who's also taken the card he thinks is the best.
Yep.
You take your next card, you add that to your pile, pass on the cards.
Okay.
And you do this for 3 packs, you end up with a bunch of cards, and from them you build yourself a deck which has size limitations and all that. It's not overly critical, but the idea is you're working versus the other 7 people that you're going to be playing against in a pool of 8 people to build your deck, and you're competing against these people. So you're trying to read signals that are going on
trying to work out what potential cards they might be taking.
So pack 1, you send the cards to the left. Pack 2, you send the cards to the right. Pack 3, you send the cards back to the left. So you get this filter of information, and you affect people on your left more than you do your right, because you pass 2 packs to the left.
Yep.
And you're able to send signals, which then mean that they wouldn't be in the same style of deck, and the way that the game's broken up is there's different colours.
That's right. And so there's counters, right? There's natural counters based on...
Yeah, and so you also have information of the card pool that's available, because you've seen a lot of the card pool by the end of the draft of what all the other players have, and you can make evaluations on what they might have based upon the colours that they picked, the things that they did, the information that you perceived during the pre-building phase while you were picking all your cards.
Yep. So that on day 2, when you went 0-3, do you feel that it was more because the others had countered the style of deck that you had built, or was it more the luck element in terms of the cards that you drew cards that they drew?
So it was like I had built close to one of the best decks from my seat that was available. This would have been the best option. I had basically the best card in that set in my deck. Things were looking really good. It's hard in limited where you're picking your cards, you don't have access to a huge number of cards. So it's hard to straight counter anybody. So the raw power of your deck really, really matters. Whereas when we talk in these formats that are like 10 years wide, there's cards that really interact and really stop your opponent doing the thing that they're trying to do. So there's like hard counters in the older formats, whereas in this condensed, limited field of cards, it's really hard to stop the person. If their deck is just like really powerful and really good, generally speaking, they're going to be in a better space. There are ways that we're countering each other and that we're understanding what to do, how to interact, and we're playing a best of 3 games. So you do have opportunities to play around their cards, play around what they're doing, especially if you have that previous information of what they may have taken or which cards interact strongly with their cards that maybe you have access to. There is going to be natural counters, but not so much. So what I would say happened is essentially I mostly just got unlucky. My deck didn't play well. Maybe I probably made some poor decisions. It's going to be a combination of lots of factors. But I would have said in a worst case scenario, if I looked at this, if I played badly, my absolute worst case scenario, looking from the outside, would have been 1 and 2.
Okay.
Like if I just saw the deck and saw everybody's deck with open information, I would have been like, how do you lose? How do you not,
win at least
how do you
one.
not win most of the time? You are just, your deck is just better than other people's decks. So to go 0-3 was a real hit. And then they make us do this again. So we do a second draft of this like limited format. And I draft a terrible deck. And I proceed to go two wins and 1 loss with my terrible deck. Not for any reason apart from the terrible cards in my deck just didn't show up and the good ones did. Because some proportion of your deck is still going to be decent and playable even when it's an absolute train wreck. And so I end up this day at 2 and 4, so my total record is 8 and 4. So I'm still in like a reasonable spot. I'm still sitting towards the top of the table of all the players. We played the team thing. My team does pretty well overall. I think we're sitting like maybe 2nd or 3rd place in the teams after day 2. So day 3 happens. And day 3 is weird because a lot of people now know that I'm going for this spot. And essentially what starts to happen is people will concede to you if they know you and they think they can help you and they think there's more value in you winning than them winning. And there's a little bit of stuff that happens around them getting access to some of your prize money in the concessions and things. That's not an overly important part, but I get 2 concessions from 2 French guys one that I've only met that day and one that I know that just comes to the table, doesn't even look me in the eye, signs the slip and walks away.
Really?
He knows the way that the split's going to work, knows everything that's going to happen, and just goes, yeah, this is more valuable for you than me.
Wow.
So I think I end up maybe at like 11 or 12 wins at the end of the tournament, and the tournament breaks down to the top 8 players go and play off. I didn't do quite well enough to come in the top 8, but our team is in the top 8 teams. So we get to playoff versus the other teams, and this adds to points. So basically at the end of this, I think the other guy has either done about equal to me or slightly better than me in the main event, and I think we need to win round 1 of the teams so that I end up winning Rookie of the Year. So yeah, the main tournament has ended and we start the playoffs, and we go through and we play the first round, and both my teammates just blitz the other guys, win in like basically what felt like seconds. My deck was the slowest out of the thing, and both my teammates just win. And so I'm Rookie of the Year, and it's awesome. And I'm super stoked, but I did nothing, right? Like I just sat there like playing my game. I think I'm in game 1, and they're playing best of 3s, and they've both beaten their opponents 2-0.
Okay.
Like,
and so
hey!
at that stage, were you already aware that you'd won? And then
yeah, because it was a separate day, we knew what we had to achieve. On the next day.
By those 2 guys winning, you're like, oh, I've done it. And
yeah,
then you
so
still gotta
basically,
focus on the game ahead of you.
Basically, well, then the team game stops because it's just who gets the best 2 out of 3 wins.
Okay.
So I just stopped my game, pick up my cards, and
that was it.
and we moved to the quarters to play against. I think we played against Italy in the quarters. I don't remember who we I don't remember exactly who we played in which round. I know we play America in the last round, and we We end up losing, but so we get through the next round, and basically the same thing happens. Both my guys, I have the slowest deck. Both my guys on my left and my right, I'm the team captain in the middle, offering them a bit of advice. But basically, they just blitz through. So they're both crushing it, and this is great. So now we're in the finals. We're going to get a lot of extra money from being in the team thing. So basically, we had Rookie of the Year on the line, and we were also trying to get, I think, into the top 8 teams.
Yep.
So there was a bunch of things at stake for us, basically getting towards the end of the tournament, especially on day 3, that every win mattered to put us in that spot.
Right standing,
And so we get to the finals, and they're playing. So the finals, they actually bring us into like a broadcasting thing, and it's bright lights, and it's basically like TV broadcasting. You've got 3 guys in a broadcast room on all mics talking about the games, overviews at the tables, 4 or 5 different camera shots coming in.
Yep.
Like you're talking like serious production.
Yeah.
And we start playing the games. My friend on the left can't lose, blitzes his opponent.
Yep.
I lose to my opponent in the middle really quickly. So both these things happen at the same time. He blitzes an opponent, and I lose to my middle opponent in the only game that I've actually had to play of this quarter series finals. Mess. And then we're down to our third player, playing against the American guys. So the American guys all gather in around their guy, and we all gather in around our guy.
Yep.
And we have this battle to the end to decide who gets to be the national team that wins Worlds for that year. It did not go our way, unfortunately. It was this long, hard game, and it was super cool. It was super cool that we were part of that, and basically through that, I got all this. I become Rookie of the Year. Our team comes second at Worlds. I have all these pro points, which means I'm going to get funded for my next year of play, and yeah, that's basically how I became a Magic professional for a time.
Wow.
So with the Magic profession thing, it's basically like every 3 months there was these like big pro tours. There was 4 a year, and the 4th one of the year is called Worlds.
Okay. Yep.
So what would happen is, so I came back to Sydney after this, and I would have basically a month before this big tournament, I would do a month of prep, then I'd fly over to the tournament, I'd stay wherever the tournament was, I'd do the tournament, and I'd come back home.
Yep.
This makes it really hard to have a job.
Yeah.
To have like relationships. If you're like, so 4 times a year, I'm basically gone for 6 weeks.
Yep.
And this is important. It also, it's just a difficult thing because your life is radically different to everybody else's life.
Yep.
And how that all fits together is pretty weird and wonderful. So at this same time, poker's booming.
Yep.
This is like the Tony Hashem poker booming. And the thing with Magic Tournament was basically we did these tournaments where you're playing like 6 rounds, 6-hour rounds. Maybe there's extension of time. And then after them, sometimes there was like top 8 events and other things like that. So we were used to playing like 12, 15 hours of cards a day in these big tournaments under these pressure situations. And what happened was a lot of the top Magic community transitioned to playing poker because there was this huge amount of money, and we'd all been building these skills for years and years and years.
Yep.
So when I came back, I basically had 2 months off between each tournament.
So you're playing poker.
Where I would play poker. And so that was my life, as I was playing poker and I was playing Magic. And it's kind of the thing of you can't really be good at lots of different things at the same time. I had competing interests where I was trying to get really good at poker and where I was trying to be really good at Magic.
Yep.
And they were fighting for space, and eventually after the year of being on the Pro Tour, I went, this is too hard and there's not enough money in it.
Yeah. So
and I started playing poker professionally, which that was basically another year of my life where I played poker. So I had a year where I played poker and Magic, kind of as the dual things that I was doing. And I was getting paid to write some articles for Magic and other bits and pieces. So there's a bunch of stuff on me in the deep dark web, where I've written really nerdy Magic stuff, and where there's recordings of me playing Magic on a big screen, and obviously losing terribly as part of my team and all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
I'm sure I probably won some games and did some good things as well, but, is what it is. So yeah, that led into me playing poker, and I already had a lot of interaction with the casino and the space, was already super comfortable with and dexterous with chips and chip tricks and all that. You can't not be around that environment and not know those things.
Yep.
And so this led into a thing where I was playing poker, both online and in real life. Basically, online was always way harder than real life, and so you use online to sharpen your skills so that you can play real life and win a whole lot of money.
Yep.
And that involves Friday, Saturday, Sunday nights playing through till daybreak, which is another terrible thing if you actually want like a relationship or to spend time in the community as a real person. And yeah, this was off the back of me not really doing jiu-jitsu and having a bit of break because I had like it leads into the glandular fever thing. But like I'm training a little bit during this time. This is where I'm getting like my first competitions, and I'm under Thiago during this time. So I was still staying at least a bit fit by doing these things and being involved in that world.
Did anyone recognize you at the casino because you used to work there, and then now you're there just playing cards?
Yeah, everybody knew. Every manager knew me. Every person knew me. And that was fine. And there was also a whole bunch of dealer games that like I was well known in all those circles. And the dealers, they'd get hungry to play because they can't play all day, and they're getting the same feed that kind of addicts people to playing games in that environment.
Yep. Yeah. Wow. Okay. And then do you still play poker now, or
no? So a year passes of me playing poker, and the thing with poker is you've got to provide your own resource. So same as Magic, you've got to show up. You've got to be enthusiastic. You've got to make this happen all the time. And when you have a bad day and you're feeling bad and you're feeling low, like the same as when my draft went 0-3, you've still got to show up and you've got to do the next draft. This is hard when it's a job. And let's say Monday night you go into the casino and you play, and you play for 2 hours and you win $1,000. And this is something that happens very easily. What's your incentive to work for the rest of the week?
Not a lot.
And I jumped into poker from Magic, but I did the Magic thing because it was an opportunity that just showed itself to me, not because I'd saved for a whole bunch of time to be ready and to be in a good spot. And then I jumped into poker from that same spot where, even when you're playing the Magic tournaments, you're still paying rent back home. You're paying for a hotel overseas. Yep. And then you're hoping to do well in this thing. And if you don't do well in this tournament and you've spent a month of your time prepping for it, 2 weeks at this event, what's your incentive to do the next one? Where do you get that drive from? And so I found this similar with poker, and it started to turn poker into a job. So I kind of turned Magic into a job, started liking it less. I turned poker into a job, I started liking it less.
Yep.
And I found this trend was a true thing with me. And so it was around this time, about 2 years in, that I had a conversation with my dad. He'd been running his wrecking yard, and he'd always been like, I would really like one of my sons to come and take over my business. I'm getting older, and, I would like to offer you guys the opportunity of
being in the business
of this thing And so I thought about that long and hard, and basically I went to my dad, and we didn't have the strongest relationship at this point. And I said, if I come to this business, you're going to need to leave this business.
Yeah.
And so we worked on an idea of how that would look. And this was done with my whole family, present and available. And I got there and I started doing my job and working on the business and doing everything I could to make it better. And I kept running basically into my dad. We clashed. There was going to be a transition period where we were going to need to work together, but we really didn't work together too well. I wanted to push forward on a lot of initiatives. He was very much in a like old school mindset and a like, let's wait things out. And I'm like, you've been here in this business for 10 plus years.
Yep.
You know, nothing's going to change unless you make it change, unless we make changes. And it was okay. Like, it was a business that was floating and fine, but never good, with heaps of potential. And what I realized as I started trying to make this change and starting to do these things is, it's firstly really hard to work with somebody that's family.
Yep.
And you have a different set of, you know, of responsibilities of how important is my family life and how important is keeping my relationships together and how much impact is this having on everybody else. So I don't think I felt that was going to get to a good space while I was working there. And the more that I pushed forward things, the more we butted heads. And the more that I realized if I took this business off him and actually did the thing that we'd agreed upon doing, that it was gonna break any chance that we had of having a relationship and that being a good thing. And so slowly, you know, I kept working there. I kept building systems. I kept building up that business. Essentially, I was the drive for the business. If I wasn't there, they were probably going to get rid of it, but it didn't have a lot of value based upon how it looked on the books without having somebody really ramp it up. So I think I ended up working there for close to 3 years before I left, and I left to go and open my own business. About a year and a half after I left, they sold that business for a bunch more money than they would have been able to without the help. But by getting out and leaving that, not taking it from my dad, I think I allowed us to have a good relationship, and I think it was super important. And I don't think there was any way that I could have actually taken that business without it doing an amount of damage that would have never been worth it. So yeah, that's how I started my own business, which was a gaming business, which I also ran for 3 years. Basically, I signed a lease for 3 years. I ran it out for 3 years. It was like the wrecking yard. It was fine. It paid the bills, but it was hard work, and I was kind of realized that I was a sacrificial lamb for it. And I was doing a thing that I loved. I've always loved gaming. I got to promote Magic, promote board gaming, promote a bunch of other live gaming, a live interaction. But I did not completely have my partner on board when I started the business, and I kind of strong-armed my way through it. And it's retail. It's huge hours. And on top of that, we were running tournaments and we were constantly building things. And, you know, I definitely was pushing, but at the same point, I don't think it realistically could have provided me with a lot of what I wanted, which was time to train, time with my fiance to be my wife at the start of next year, and time to just spend with family and friends. And I found I was taking too much and I was putting too much into the business, often, 60 plus hour weeks. And I just wasn't getting the things that I needed out of it. And, I think if you're going to make those sacrifices, like, you need to be on a seriously large income to justify those short-term sacrifices that you're making. And you also need to know that they're only going to be short-term sacrifices, that it is going to be big enough and good enough that you can separate yourself from the sacrifice. Yeah. And I just couldn't see light at the end of the tunnel in respect to that. So at the start of last year, I had some chats with David and a bunch of other people that have been mentors and close friends to me and business owners. And the thing that I came up with, like, I set out a list of my priorities, and right up the top was my training. And I started a conversation with David, and he was like, I think you should be running a gym. You know?
Yeah.
It was him offering the way that he blended his life with his social, with his wife, with everything that he wanted to achieve, and how he'd gone about doing it. And it just started to make more and more sense the deeper that we got into it, the more that we chatted. It made sense that it is a good opportunity to build something that relates to all of the things that I actually want in my life, and allows me a lot more space and a lot more time, while being something I can really dig my teeth into and really have a good go at. So, yeah, that's basically the short version of how I got to the point of where I've now just set up a gym, which is closed right now. But I feel really confident that it's a thing that I'm going to be able to make work and fit with my life and fit with the life that I ideally want. And I think that's got to be your goal, trying to get your life to align with the things that you most want and most need to make you happy and to make your life fruitful. And if that's not what's happening in your life, you can change.
Yeah.
You should, you know. You should if, you know, the business that you went to, cool, it was an opportunity with the wrecking yard. I realized that it wasn't the opportunity that was right, that it was going to be damaging and that wasn't a good thing. That I thought that the game shop, it was a thing that I loved, a thing that I wanted to invest time in, but then I realized that it was at a cost of everything else in my life and that cost was kind of too great. So I've made a change, and I think I've now got the best fit for what I want to do, and it took those iterations of business and choices and learning, and you know, you learn from all those businesses, you learn from those experiences.
Right. They're all growth experiences. You've learned, you know, the experiences that you gain working in each of those different industries, you can pull together, you know, in this latest iteration. But I think, you know, from what you know, that passion that you have in terms of the, you know, your jiu-jitsu journey and your martial arts journey, you're trying to pull all that together into this one space now. I think you're probably more aligned, you know, with your passions, you know, because as you said previously though, you know, when you were really into the magic thing, when it became a job, you know, it's like a chore.
Yeah, and you know, you talked about a lot of the things like how you got we're very good at getting single-minded in the things that we do because we have a little bit obsessive personalities. So like I found when I was doing magic, I was just doing magic. When I tried to do magic and poker, I couldn't do both. And so that quickly transitioned to just doing the one that made the most sense. Also that I could do from my bed.
Yep.
You know, like there's benefits.
Yeah. I take the, I think I have like the Gatling gun approach, I would say, where, you know, if I have an interest in something, I'll just pursue it. But then I also, like, I get very singular in my focus, but then I also try and pull it back in terms of like, you know, that translation of skills, because, you know, just like, you know, you were in the wrecking yard.
Can we pause for just a second?
Yeah.
Just need to go to the bathroom.
All good. All right. Sorry. We had a small intermission. We're back. Yeah. So we're talking about, I guess, you know, bringing together those different learnings. So, you know, basically, even though you're working in a specific industry and it may sound like, oh, that, you know, being in a wrecking yard has nothing to do with running a jiu-jitsu gym, the elements of that, it's small business.
So the funny thing is, like, I went to the wrecking yard with no idea basically about cars.
Okay.
Because like I'd separated myself from my dad and the things that he'd done due to our time basically in my teens, where it was...
Well, see, I think, you know, for you, right, like that view of what your dad was doing with the wrecking yard, it was like a separation from your own ability to have an emotional connection with him, right? Yep. So because of that, you know, you didn't have that same sort of enthusiasm towards it, because rather than see it for something that's a fun endeavor like he probably was seeing it, you saw it as something that was taking your dad away from you.
It was also like the place where we'd go in and work for him, and he wasn't overly fun as a dad to work for. It was like go and clean engines with, you know, put on all this protective gear and spray an engine with some form of like acid, and then spray it with a gun to clean it so that it can go to a cut. And you're like, this isn't fun, and you get wet and it's cold, and I don't want to do this when I'm 16, 17, you know, like I have zero interest in this. And he didn't really have interest in the things that I did when I was getting into all these like card games and nerdy things. It was very far away from his realm, which still exists basically in cars and bikes and things. Like you probably can't have much conversation with him that doesn't eventually lead to some version of like motorsport or about cars or things. And that's fine. There's I think there's people in the world where you've got to jump on their passions more than they'll jump on your passions. They find it hard to connect with you in that same way. And I just realized as I got older that I had to be more giving in a lot of those spaces. Because I still love a lot of the things. Like I love racing go-karts, and I love a lot of like I like the end result of getting to race the car. I don't like working on the car to get to race the car. But there's ways I can engage and be part of the things that he's doing. No,
that's fair enough. Well, I think we can call it there, eh? We've done, you know, like I think about an hour and 40 or something.
Yeah, we've done.
It's gone pretty fast. But that was awesome, man. I really do appreciate it having you on. And you know, for anyone wanting to check it out, well, it's not open at the moment, but Integrated Combat Centre, there are 2 locations. There's one in Peakhurst and there's one in Canterbury. So Aaron's looking after the Canterbury branch. And, you know, hopefully, you know, when this COVID-19 thing blows over, you know, people can get back into it and get their fixes and, you know, get back involved in the community. And I guess, you know, even if you are taking time off from training at the present moment, no matter what kind of training you're doing, whether it's, you know, Kung Fu or Jiu-Jitsu or kickboxing or whatever, you know, martial arts, still mixed martial arts training that you're doing, I think, you know, it's still worthwhile to reach out and touch base with, you know, the people that, you know, you were close with in training and your training partners and things like that in these times, because, you know, it does get lonely otherwise.
Make those connections. The connections outside of just the gym really matter. And as you let people into your life, we spend hours and hours on the mats rolling around 3 centimeters away from each other, if not closer. We should also know a little bit about where people come from and what their life's like. Yeah, and that's one of the craziest things, right? Like, you know, I think, you know, any sort of martial arts academy is like a great leveler in terms of the playing field, because, you know, you don't know the person that you're drilling with or rolling with or sparring with or whatever. They might be at a particular point in their professional life that is like, you know, 10 years ahead of you or 20 years ahead of you, but on the mat, it's all even. All that doesn't mean jack shit. However, that sort of connection, if you can build those connections, like those people, if you have a good relationship and a good friendship, you know, they'll want to help you and be good mentors and friends for you when, you know, if you have questions and want to bounce things off that don't necessarily just relate to martial arts. Definitely. Yeah. All right, we'll leave it at that. And yeah. Thank you for having me. No worries. Thank you.